Hello, and welcome to the Project Learn microlearning focused on motivation and incentives. As we get started, reflect on two questions. When do you notice that youth in your club are most motivated? And when do you notice that youth in your club are least motivated? Maybe this has to do with the time of day, certain topics that they're more or less interested in, or maybe it's the structure of an activity. Maybe you notice that youth are really motivated when they're working with a partner, but they get less motivated when they're working in a group that's so large that they could just tune out. Or maybe you notice that young people are really motivated when they're involved in a contest or a competition, and they're less motivated when there's less structure. Whatever the case may be, and this will be different for different young people, just take some time to think about these two questions. And if you're with a colleague, pause and discuss. This session is focused on the fifth component of Project Learn, motivation and incentives. A few promising practices when it comes to motivation. Motivation is so critical for learning. We get a lot more mileage out of helping young people to be motivated to learn than always offering learning activities that they're just not interested in. So a few promising practices. One is to celebrate youth for their effort and progress, not just the final results. It's oftentimes much easier to incentivize final results, to say, if everyone gets A's and B's, we're going to have a big pizza party. But you don't find out until the end of the year if you've gotten A's and B's. And so that is a long time to wait before an incentive. It's a better practice to celebrate youth for effort and progress along the way, and to recognize when they're trying really hard, to recognize when they're demonstrating certain skills, or to recognize if they're gradually improving. Another best practice is to give youth opportunities to recognize one another. A lot of club staff are great at giving recognition themselves, of saying things like, oh, I noticed that you got a lot faster since last week. You've really been practicing. Or I noticed that you stopped and helped a friend and that was really kind. But it's also a good practice to invite young people to recognize one another. You can do this at the end of a session by saying, who do you want to recognize for sharing a really good suggestion today? Or who do you want to recognize for communicating really clearly today? Invite young people to also recognize their peers for the way that they demonstrate skills or make progress. Another best practice is to avoid empty praise, because encouragement is more effective. If you want to learn more about this, I really recommend the Ask, Listen, Encourage training, which is one of the Weichert Center trainings, and it's available through Spillett Leadership University. But it's really important that we're encouraging young people by pointing out specific things that they're doing well, not just giving empty praise, which looks like, you're awesome, you're the best, way to go. Those sort of phrases that might seem like recognition, but they're really just empty praise because they don't have the detail and the specificity of encouragement. One other best practice here is to consider different types of motivation, including both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Motivation is a spectrum, ranging from some things that we are just unmotivated by, we're not interested in doing it for any reason. And then there are things that we're extrinsically motivated to do, where the motivation comes from the outside, either in the form of a reward or a punishment or some other external pressure. And then there's intrinsic motivation, where the motivation comes from inside of ourselves, either because there's some sort of internal drive to do it, or ultimately because we really enjoy it and we just want to do whatever the thing is that we're motivated to do. To break that spectrum down a little bit more, here's what this might sound like. Of course, if someone says, I'm not going to do this for any reason, they're unmotivated. If someone says, I'm doing this because there's a reward or a punishment set up for me, that's just one step above unmotivated. So if young people are only doing their homework because they know there's some punishment if they don't do it, or they're only doing their homework because they know it's the only way that they can get an incentive, and that's an example of extrinsic motivation. One step above that is doing this because you know you're supposed to. That's still extrinsic because somebody outside of you has said you're supposed to do this, and that's what's motivating you. Another step into the intrinsic side of the spectrum is when we do things because we personally think they're important. I can think of some things that I don't necessarily enjoy doing, but I think they're important, and so I'm motivated to do them. But ultimately, sort of the height of intrinsic motivation is when we do things because we really enjoy doing them. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are both good. It's not like one is good and one is bad, but they're effective for different kinds of situations. Extrinsic motivation is effective for small, short-term behavior change, whereas intrinsic motivation is what drives deeper, long-term behavior change. So, for instance, if I feel like I should exercise more, I would be intrinsically motivated if I choose a kind of exercise that I really enjoy doing. And that's likely to make me healthy for the rest of my life. If it's something that I can keep doing because I enjoy it, I'm more likely to make some long-term life changes if I choose a kind of exercise that I'm intrinsically motivated to do. Whereas if I really just need to make a few simple changes, if I say, you know what, I just need to make a small change. I need to make sure that I'm getting up and going for a walk for the next couple days, then I could set up some sort of reward or punishment or ask someone else to help remind me that this is something I'm supposed to do and rely on that extrinsic motivation. An example that might be more relevant to Project Learn here would be that if the behavior change you're focused on is that you want young people to really love learning, to be independent learners, to be interested in pursuing higher education, you're going to need to rely on intrinsic motivation, finding ways to help young people fall in love with learning. Whereas if the behavior that you're trying to work on is that you really just need young people to write down their homework assignments in their planner, that's a really simple, small behavior change. And so an extrinsic motivation system would work great for that. If you say, we're going to keep track of who wrote down their homework in their planner, and we're going to have some sort of exciting reward at the end of the week if we're able to meet this goal. Extrinsic motivation works great for those small, short-term behavior changes. That might lead you to wonder, if intrinsic motivation is more effective for these big long-term behavior changes, how do we help intrinsically motivate young people? And there are basically three keys to intrinsic motivation, which are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And we'll talk about each of those in just a moment. So, two big categories of motivation. There's extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. Here are some best practices for each of those. For extrinsic motivation, you want to establish positive incentives instead of only negative consequences. You may know this from your own life, but oftentimes positive incentives are more motivating than the threat of a negative consequence. Another best practice is to let youth choose the incentive. So in the example I gave of encouraging everyone to write down their homework assignments in their planner, if I choose the incentive, if I say, if everyone writes down their homework assignments in the planner, then at the end of the week, we can go for a nature walk. That might not be what young people want to do, and it might not motivate them at all. A better practice would be for me to say, we're setting a goal that everyone's going to write down their homework assignments in their planner. If we can all do that for a week, what would be an exciting prize? And youth might choose something that's too big of an incentive. They might choose something that's too expensive or too extravagant. And you can kind of dial it back. But whatever they choose, maybe it's, we get to choose the music that we listen to while we're doing homework, or we get to have this special experience or this special treat. When young people choose the incentive, it's more motivating. Another best practice for extrinsic motivation is to set both group goals and individual goals. Some young people are going to be more motivated by that team feeling of we're all trying to do this, and others are going to be more motivated by an individual goal. Like if you personally remember to write down your homework in your planner, then this is what you can get as a result. Either way, whether it's a group goal or an individual goal, you want to recognize progress toward the goal. Don't just wait until everything's all over to say yes or no, you met the goal. Recognizing progress is really important. Finally, it's important to be consistent and be fair. This is particularly true if you're using any kind of negative consequences, because unfair consequences create a feeling of injustice and are very demotivating. I mentioned the 3 key intrinsic motivation strategies, but let's talk about what they mean. So the 3 best ways to support intrinsic motivation. The first is autonomy. So youth are more intrinsically motivated when they have authentic choices. So when they're getting to choose what they learn or how they learn or who they learn with or any other aspects that are youth voice and choice, that's very motivating. Competence is the second key. This means that you're recognizing the way that youth are improving and building new skills. So when someone tells you you're getting better at this, like I saw you struggle with this last week and this week you're doing a lot better, you're building competence, that's very motivating, and that tends to support intrinsic motivation. And the last key to intrinsic motivation is relatedness. You can support relatedness by connecting what youth are learning to relevant topics. So make sure that it's related to their real life, it's related to stuff they care about, and also that it's relational. So they're learning with their peers, or they're thinking about how a topic relates to other people. That's another key to intrinsic motivation. So if you find yourself in a situation where youth don't seem to be motivated, the first question would be, are we trying to motivate young people to do something really small and short term, in which case maybe we want to choose an extrinsic motivation strategy or an incentive structure? Or are we trying to motivate young people to take on a big lifelong behavior change, in which case, what opportunities do we see to support autonomy, competence, and relatedness? 2 reflection questions for you before you go. Take a moment to think about which extrinsic motivation strategies you might implement with your youth. And also think about what intrinsic motivation strategies you could implement with your youth. So think about a few scenarios when some added motivation could be helpful, and consider which strategies you're going to use. Feel free to pause to write these down or discuss with a colleague. And whenever you're ready, a few next steps to try. I want to encourage you to visit the Club Experience blog and search for motivation. You'll see lots of great stories from clubs about various ideas for how to motivate, recognize, and incentivize youth. So read through those ideas and choose a few that you think would be interesting to try in your own club. And one other action item for you or the other staff in your club would be to participate in the Ask, Listen, Encourage training, which is available on Spillett Leadership University.